All right. Oh, and I'm always so loud. Pull it back. Hello, everybody. Week four. Week 4, and thank you. I believe, actually, all of you have come each week, correct? Congratulations. Oh, pretty close. Anyways, welcome to week 4 of the Wellness Challenge. We are at our last lunch and learn here, and we only have a few more days of keeping track of points. So I hope that everybody has enjoyed these 4 weeks. Hopefully there's been some awareness, possibly feeling a little energetic, drinking water, getting more sleep, all those things. We know about it all the time, and the fact of the Wellness Challenge, it isn't like for 4 weeks of our life we're going to be healthy and then on Monday next week we get to go unhealthy. You can if you want, it's totally up to you. However, the idea was that hopefully you'll establish a few new healthy habits. Couple little things, especially for those here but also watching on the video. Video will be up by tomorrow. Also, so Sunday night will be the last of recording points. Try to get those points to your captains as soon as you can, because the captains need to get all the points to me by next Friday, February 22nd. So Friday, February 22nd, I need all points in. Takes me a few days just to calculate, make sure I've got everything correct. So the winners will be revealed the following week, hopefully early in the week. And again, remember there's a winner for a team prize. That's the highest average points. But there's also 5 individual winners, and that would be the highest points for those individuals. Other than that, I wanted to mention, obviously this week, the weekly challenge is to try a new recipe. And I heard that the frittata was very good, so try that out. I haven't tried it. Thank you to the registered dietitians who sent those recipes in to me, so thank you for that. There is one more 5 bonus points that are out there for grabs for everybody. And it's if you will complete my questionnaire that I am going to put on to the team captains. So when the team captains get it, there'll be a link, and you can go on there, probably 5 minutes, I don't think more than 5 minutes, just to answer a few questions to give me feedback on what went well, give me suggestions. Every year I look at them and I do make changes based on that. So if you do answer the the Survey Monkey questionnaire, there are 5 bonus points for that, okay, for this week. Other than that, I think that's everything. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Saskatchewan Health Authority for, do we have somebody coming in? Oh, right. For coming and providing all of these presentations for the last 3 weeks. And today we have Ralph from Saskatchewan Health Authority that's also here to speak to us on stigmas and addictions. So thank you for coming, and I will pass the microphone to you. You just need to hit that on and you're good to go. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Val. So, yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Ralph Amon, and I am with Saskatchewan Health Authority, and my role is in addictions and mental health. Today is Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day. I thought about, doing a presentation on addiction, and I should let you know that chocolate addiction does not count today. So you're good to go if that's a concern. So as Val mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about addiction, but particularly, just to give you a little background, but I want to emphasize wellness and things that, you can do as an individual, or as a family, or even as a community. And then I also want to talk, secondly, about stigma. And that's a significant factor in terms of both addictions and mental health. So when we think about addiction, there's lots of different definitions, but essentially it's just kind of that I continue using a substance and engaging in that despite experiencing, some negative things like, problems with family, problems work, school, or in the community. And we know there's sort of two types of addiction. There's what we call physiological addiction, which is my body physically is addicted. But then there's also the psychological addiction, where really my coping and my way of handling, life in general is impacted. And so often people can have both. Sometimes, depending upon the substance, they might just have one. So when we think about habits versus addiction, well, a habit is just that I really sort of just continue to do. And so, it might be, it can be lots of really good things too. I might have a habit of whistling. I'm not a whistler, but, just as an example. But also when we start to talk about a compulsion, is really where we're crossing the line into addiction. And so really, as a result of this compulsion, I start to really experience a lot of discomfort if I'm not engaging in that. And, and I perhaps really struggle either mentally or physically without that activity. And so that's what when we talk about addiction, we're really speaking about that. So a couple of things, four areas that we really see with addiction. Obsession, so I'm thinking lots about the activity. And there's lots of addictions out there. It could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it can be gambling. There's quite a long list. Also, I might have loss of control, where once I start the activity, all of a sudden I have a hard time stopping or reducing. It's like almost once I start, it's like a runaway train, and I have a hard time predicting when it may stop. Also, negative consequences. So negative things are starting to happen, and sometimes not just to me, the person that might be engaged in, say, an addictive behavior, but also perhaps those around me, my family, my workplace, and just even my community. And then the other aspect that we see really with addiction is this thing called denial, where despite the evidence, I'm really not really wanting to talk about it or look at it. So it can be right in front of my face, but I look elsewhere. So on here, we see sort of this cycle. So it starts off some emotional pain. I may be craving for some type of relief. I start thinking often about the substance. It would be nice maybe to get it. And then, all of a sudden I start using the substance or engaging in the behavior compulsively. All of a sudden I have some short-term pain relief. So, the pressure is off. I'm kind of numbing out. However, there's always usually negative consequences. So something goes wrong. Relationship problems, family problems, work, etc. And then often I experience following that some depression. I perhaps feel really guilty. And often I'm really, really ashamed of what I've done or who I've become as a result of this addiction. And that just leads to more pain, low self-esteem, and then of course more emotional pain, and the cycle just continues. So some of the risk factors for addiction, and these speak not just in terms of risk factor, but these also speak about things that are really critical for wellness. So for instance, unusually early response to the substance or the experience. So often people, things like, say with alcohol, all of a sudden, let's say I can drink a whole lot, surprisingly. That is really, is a risk factor. One of the interesting things with people who often struggle with gambling is often early on in gambling, they had a big win. And so what it does, it just sort of sets them up in terms of future gambling, thinking that I'm going to get that again. And of course, all the good feelings that come with that. Often folks who have, learning disabilities or other conditions like, they're hyperactive are at risk. Also, if I've got a history of depression, that can be a risk factor. And also, if I've got family members who have had struggles with addiction, that's often a risk factor. So psychologically, low self-esteem, we know is, and it makes a lot of sense in terms of when we think about peer pressure, things like that, I can really be at risk. Also in terms of problems or difficulties that I might run into, if I'm looking outside of myself for solutions or answers rather than perhaps looking inside or to my supports. So looking outside, perhaps I might turn, say, particularly to a substance or activity that can provide some relief. Often if I tend to be really passive, that puts me at risk for addiction, because I may struggle to assert myself. Also, if I've had a lot of trauma, or if I've been, abused. So some of these things in terms of wellness, we know that, investing in self-esteem, investing in things like learning how to be assertive with other people, is really helpful in terms of protecting ourselves. Sometimes things like trauma, we can't always avoid that. But if we have that awareness, then it helps us to know that we may be at risk. In our environment, So ready access to the substance or experience. And so, it's kind of like if I work in a chocolate store, chocolate is the theme today, guess what I might be quite susceptible to overindulging in chocolate. And so when we think about, say, alcohol or other, activities, that becomes a factor. If I'm around it a lot or exposed to it, I'm at risk. Certainly if I've experienced abuse or neglect at home. If in my peer group, and say heavy drinking or drug use is normal, that puts me at risk. Sometimes, when we think about peers, we think primarily of adolescents or young adults, but it's not just, that age cohort. We're also talking about adults and even much older. If the crowd that I'm with drinks, say, heavily or engages in other addictive substances or activities, I'm certainly going to be at risk. Misperception of what we call peer norms, which is just simply, I think that it's normal, that we do this stuff. So for instance, it could even be sports, where sometimes people really, I'm involved in playing sports, but I think it's normal after the game that I overindulge in alcohol. And just start to think that, well, that's just normal. Sometimes if I'm part of a group that's really struggling in our community. So it could be, say, a group that, maybe just is, can be anything from a new group of people who have moved to Swift Current. It might even be a minority of sorts. If I feel like I'm not fitting in, that can certainly put me at risk. And then also just any life stress can put people at risk. So if all of a sudden I've got a serious health problem and I'm really struggling mentally to cope or manage with that health issue, that can put me at risk in terms of overindulging. In terms of family and friends, well, we see, sometimes we talk about this term codependency, where almost it's like I have this addicted person in my family, but I'm almost just as addicted to them, where I perhaps take on a lot of responsibility looking after this person's every need, and really to my own detriment. So and part of that is sometimes I think that maybe by really over helping this other person, that they may change their behavior. And that's where we get into this enabling, where all of a sudden either I know that I'm helping things out, or I may not even realize that perhaps what I'm doing is actually I'm protecting this person from experiencing natural negative consequences. And so it can be things like, I'm maybe giving this person money or bailing them out of, their consequences. And at the end of the day, they're not changing their behavior. All that's happening is that I'm really getting drained. And so this is really important, for folks who maybe have a family member or a close friend who is struggling with substances. We can find ourselves getting into these roles that can be really detrimental to us. And we often will see, in the work that I do, I will often see folks who are in these roles are really in difficult situations themselves, not just the person maybe that's struggling with an addiction. So one of the things, and I think this is important in terms of us as a community, recognizing that even if I all of a sudden address addiction, and particularly either for younger, middle-aged adults, there can still be a number of things that I'm left to deal with in the community. And I think this challenge for this is, do we have a community that supports people in these areas? So education. So a person could be anywhere from 25 to 40. And perhaps part of my addiction was that, I didn't participate in education and learning. So do we have those opportunities to help people get better? Work history. could be really minimal or spotty. And so do we have opportunities in terms of helping people re-enter and develop some positive work experience? Income can be an issue. I may have a criminal background. I may not have a good rental history. Bad credit. I may have debt, back taxes. My family might be unstable, and I may struggle to access services. We might think, as a community, well, what's my part in this? And I think that is for each of you to sort of think about. But what we know is if these things are not addressed, often these folks in our community will return to misusing substances, which is really unfortunate. And so then the cycle just continues. Some other things, safe, affordable place to live. I think in our community largely that can be and certainly is. Do we have employment ready? Do we have education? Life recovery skills. So in the work that I do, that's a lot of the work I do, is really helping people in terms of life and recovery skills. Somebody who has struggled with addiction, they often don't have good coping skills or know how to do sometimes even just some really basic things. Even things like how to cook a meal may not be something that they've ever really done. Health and wellness, what you're doing here, often that is something that is completely foreign. Sober social support networks. So often folks will become involved with groups like AA or Narcotics Anonymous. That can be a really good support. A sense of belonging and purpose, and just that whole sense that I'm connected to family and ultimately really to the community. Do I feel like I belong where I live? And really, really vital. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about stigma here. And so when we think about stigma, it really refers to sort of the negative attitudes and negative behavior toward people, say, with mental health problems and addiction problems. And what it means is that I have sort of these fixed ideas and judgments about people, and as a result of that, I might fear and avoid what I don't understand. So sometimes I might see somebody who perhaps is struggling with, say, a mental illness or an addiction concern, and I may decide, that person's either dangerous or, I'm afraid of what could happen, and so I may completely decide to avoid them, which we know is often not the case. People with mental health difficulties often won't seek help for fear of being labeled. And I see that so much, is folks who are struggling, they're afraid that somehow other people are going to think poorly of them. And as a result of that, I won't talk to, say, my family physician, or I won't talk to, say, a counselor. Often people with mental health problems feel as though they're not accepted in the community. Sometimes I will see things like people will really become almost prisoners in their own home. Because often, for a number of reasons, but one of them can be, I feel like there's nothing really that I can participate in. Also, employment, social activities, and housing are often a barrier for those with mental illness. So sometimes I will see folks who maybe have a group of people that they do activities with or socialize with, and all of a sudden, let's say I'm struggling perhaps with some anxiety or some depression, and people sometimes then will really pull away and think, well, they probably don't want to hang out with me or be, or be around. And so just really critical that, if we have somebody in our circle, that we are reaching out to them. Just to really, not only, just to check on them, but also to continue to invite them to belong. Also, families with a loved one who experiences mental illness often feel a lot of shame, and they can feel blamed, and they often have a lack of supports. So it's not unusual for families to sort of, could become this situation where, we just don't talk about it. And thinking, because perhaps I'm ashamed of what's going on in my family. Often there's a lack of understanding about mental illness. And, as a result of that, I probably am maybe not getting the support that I could really use. So just a couple of things. So in the last 12 months, among those with a mental health or addictions problem, it's estimated that only 32% or 1/3 seek help. So we've got almost 2/3 of people out there struggling who are perhaps to some degree are just suffering in silence. And it's often connected to some type of a stigma related to that. And as I mentioned, many people are really not well informed about mental health problems. And so some of the myths that are out there about mental illness are that people are violent. And unfortunately, the media really over-sensationalizes that. Of the very few incidents where this occurs, those are the ones that end up, in the media. But we don't hear about the thousands and thousands of other cases where people get help and get much better. We often don't hear about that. Thoughts that, I have perhaps a mental illness or an addiction issue, that I'm lazy. And often, one of the things I will say is that nobody has on their bucket list that, I want to be depressed to the point where, I don't feel like getting out of bed. Nobody says, when I grow up, I want to be addicted to, crystal meth. Nobody has that wish or desire. And then that last point, that they could make themselves better if they wanted to. And again, when we think about that bucket list, most people who are really struggling with addiction or mental health, nobody wants that. And if they could easily stop it or change it, they would. But it's not. Often people need help. They need assistance. A few years ago, the Ontario psychiatrists took out some full-page newspaper ads in Ontario just to try to address the stigma. And often, we recognize the difference between physical illness, in terms of, we often have a lot of compassion for people who have a physical illness. But when it comes to a mental health condition, sometimes that compassion or understanding is not there. And so these ads, I'll show you them here, really are sort of to challenge some of that. So the first ad there says, heart disease, just an excuse for lazy people not to work. And we see the absurdity in that. That, no one has heart disease because, I don't want to work. And yet often with mental health concerns, we may think that way. Or another one, a lot of people get cancer because they can't deal with reality. Again, we know that that is absurd. However, with mental health concerns and addiction concerns, we may, have that type of a thinking or similar thinking. Okay. I know this has been brief, but any questions? Where's the chocolate, eh?
Yeah. If we dangle chocolate in front, will you have questions? I usually have tons of questions. I'm not too sure why I looked at it.
Are there statistics around the Southwest as to how many people there might be with mental illness?
Well, we know that roughly 1 out of every 10 will experience some problems with mental health concerns. So if we think about, say in this area, there's approximately 44,000 people in the Southwest. So we're talking about 4,400 people at any given time are struggling. Yeah. So it is a significant number. And it's often, that would be what we would call a sort of a primary concern. Often if I have particularly like a chronic health problem, things like depression are often a secondary concern. Or if I'm on disability, for whatever reason, a mental health concern is often secondary to that disability. So the numbers are big. Any other questions?
When you think about a physical ailment, you often can think of a cure. But when you
Yes.
think about mental health and addictions issues, it's not, you don't really think of somebody's being cured from alcoholism. It's just an ongoing process for them. So I think that's something that people miss,
Yeah.
is that that's a lifetime. It's a lifetime that people have to deal with.
Yeah.
Depression or addiction issues.
Yeah.
It's not something that just kind of ends. Or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, it's often, it is that whole recovery, that ongoing, management. And so, even when you think about wellness, it is, you can't just sort of do wellness for 3 months or 6 months and then, that's all I need to do. It's ongoing. And at times it can be a lot of work. So, no, that's a good point. Any other questions or comments?
Would you say that mental wellness, mental health, I guess, in my mind in the last, for sure, 10 years, it seems to now be at least conversation, and that's come right from marketing. It's conversation that we're having more. That doesn't mean that there's a cure, but I think it's a healthy thing that people can talk about it. And I know, all the stigmas that you said there, it doesn't mean that it's going to release them, that you're not going to have a stigma of having shame or guilt or that, something's wrong with me. But would you say in your practice that you feel this is a good movement where where more conversations happening?
Yeah, very much. I think, years ago, often when people would even come into our clinic or they would phone, in terms of perhaps wanting to access services, often people would be very, very secretive, or they would be really ashamed. And, we see much less of that today. People are often much more open, whether it's, with family, friends, or even in terms of coming in for services. And that really needed to change. However, we still have a ways to go on that. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, I guess it comes back to there isn't a cure. It's something we're all working on.
Yeah.
I'd actually say that it's 100% of us that deal with mental health throughout our lives, because there's no way that we can say we haven't had dark days, blue days, down days, blah days, weeks, months, times of life, right? Like, I think sometimes if we come to the idea that we're all on a journey with mental health, we are all just at different stages,
Yes.
some needing more support at different times, right?
Yes.
And the more compassionate that we are in understanding, especially when you're raising your kids and trying to raise them in the sense that, yeah, I know right now seems like a really tough time, but, we can help you through it. So I guess with that, I'd like to say a huge thank you to yourself and the other 3 presenters, because it was brought up on the Survey Monkey last year. Someone said, what about having lunch and learn around mental health? So I do take those into consideration, and I think it's a wonderful idea that we've had 4 weeks to discuss, to learn. None of us are experts at this, and it's a journey we're on. So thank you very much, Ralph, and all of the presenters. Thank you for everyone for attending. Go get those last few days, get as many points as you can, and we'll be waiting for the results. February 22nd, all points from team captains have to be to me, and then we'll wait for the winners. But you are all winners because you're all participating, so thank you.
Awesome.
Turn this up.